All right, my computer says it's 7, so I'll call this meeting of Topsham Planning Board on January 21st or 19th, 2021 to order. I'm Scott Luby, the Vice Chair, sitting in for Don Span. And Rod, did you say you'd do the roll call? Okay.
I will. All right, Scott Libby.
Here.
Dan Flagg.
Present.
Ron Bisson.
Yeah.
Larry Brand.
Present.
Josh Spooner.
Here.
And Bruce and Don both checked in. Don may try to make the meeting tonight. Bruce is unable to make the meeting tonight.
All right, and we don't have any minutes to look at or to vote on, so I'll entertain a motion to adjourn to go to workshop.
So move. I move we adjourn to go to workshop.
In a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right. The meeting's over and we'll adjourn to workshop on a number of ordinances, which I think the waiver procedures is first, Rod or Andrew?
Okay.
Or does it matter?
Can start that up. I'm trying to opening it up on my computer, so give me 1 second here.
Rod, I'm not sure if you're trying to connect to the network, but I can't. Something's down with the network.
Yeah, I'm trying to open up my folder and it's not happening. So the network is not up. So I assume you guys have that in front of you then.
I can get your memo out if that's helpful, Rod.
If you have that, yeah, I don't have that.
Hang on.
Yep. Well, essentially what you guys saw from what I worked on was from the last meeting, compiling, the comments of compiling all the same waiver standards for every section that allows a waiver and redoing them to be consistent. So that's what we did, and we added a few items per your direction. So if you have any comments on those, we can take those and try to spruce it
Rod,
up.
I can share your document if it'd be helpful. I'm not sure if it is or not.
Yeah, go ahead and share. What I need to do when we finalize this for town meeting is identify every section of code and make the changes as you see. Andrew just shared that. So one thing we can do is I can send out a Word document if that's helpful for folks, if they want to get in and edit it, for any suggestions that you may have as we move forward. But are there any comments right now as this is presented?
I didn't have any comments on the waiver ones. I thought it looked pretty good. I was all set with that. Anyone else?
Go ahead.
I thought they looked pretty good from what I read.
The only question I had, Rod, or Andrew, is, well, on the second page, where it talks about the planning staff scheduling the request for consideration by the board. And under sub B, it says provide adequate notice to the applicant and any other involved parties. is that a term of art? I mean, is there something that in somewhere that I missed or just didn't think of
Well,
that
that's something.
defines what involved parties is?
Well, just by the right above that, Larry, it says planning board at a public hearing. So public hearing notices have a certain protocol that we follow, which may just make moot that second statement anyway, but that's lingering language. We can fix that if we need to. Yeah, I
Okay.
don't know what,
Yeah.
and to answer your question more directly, I don't really have a definition of involved parties.
Okay, yeah, that was the whole thing, because like you say, sub A is public hearing, and like you say, there's certain abutter notification
Yeah.
requirements, et cetera.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's why I said any other involved parties just was like, okay, what does that mean? So it seemed kind of superfluous to my mind anyway.
And then actually, now that we're looking at this, I guess I would have a suggestion that instead of just a 60-day receipt, we deem it complete to bring to the board. That it would have to go through some sort of completeness review by the staff to make sure that it's, instead of just bringing it 60 days.
Right, of completed, completed application receipt.
I had a few questions about the waiver language.
Okay.
Just, it was hard for me to understand. I think the intent is to boil down all of our various waivers that are throughout the ordinance into one section where we can turn to know under what circumstances certain provisions of the ordinance can be waived. And if that's the case, is this, the language that's struck is clearly existing language, and the language that's underlined, is that new language entirely out of thin blue air, or is it from somewhere else in the ordinance that's been transferred to this particular section that we're looking at now?
So this is to what you're seeing in front of you now is to have one standard that we can agree upon makes sense. My next step would be to go through the ordinance and strike out all of the other sections. I would say that, Josh, these will be going back into those sections versus having one spot, because they're we don't have a unified code here. So we do need to split them up to reflect where the waivers are applicable. That would be the kind of path of least resistance for this coming year. So what you're seeing in front of you is there were two similar places in the ordinance that I took and just went with one of them, and then I'll go back and kind of edit each one specifically to reflect the one that you see in front of you.
Okay, but the underlined language is language that currently exists elsewhere
Yes.
in our ordinance.
The underlined note, some of this is new language completely based upon reviewing other ordinances throughout Maine. And we had a discussion a few weeks back about what you guys wanted to see. So I put those things in for your review.
Okay. In the in A1, where it says the deviation is unavoidable and represents the minimum feasible, you mean the minimum feasible deviation?
Yep, that's what that's referring to.
And just above that, there's the usual public health, safety, and general welfare, and then environment is there. Is that elsewhere in our ordinance at the moment?
No, that was suggested by Dan at the last meeting, so I put it in. I didn't hear any objection to that.
I guess I don't object to it necessarily. I know that the police, generally speaking, as a planning board, our power is derived as a police power, which is why we're able to impose restrictions on land use, which might otherwise be deemed a regulatory taking. And so the police power references public health, safety, and general welfare, and doesn't reference the environment, which is probably why I haven't seen it before.
Right.
Arguably, the environment is tied up within the concept of public health. and general welfare and safety. But it's not typically called out when I have reviewed ordinances in the past, our ordinance. And of course, I always reference my Biddeford experience. So I don't know if we're moving outside some norm that's been followed for a long time if we specifically reference environment.
For the waiver, I don't think we're overstepping any bounds here. We allow deviation from code in other sections in regards to allowing an applicant to not have to connect a road due to the natural resources that are there and would be impacted otherwise type of language. So it does exist elsewhere, not in the same vein, I suppose. But it's a granting of a waiver so that if you find that the impact on the environment would be less if you grant the waiver, then that's a finding of fact.
Okay.
So it's up to you folks if you want to be putting that in there.
Hey, Rod, I just have a comment. Can you provide a little background on the language for the purpose? You know, I understand in general what we're trying to achieve here, but I just did that come from some other codes you reviewed? And is it broad enough to be an appropriate purpose, I guess?
Well, that's up for you guys to discuss. What I did with this was I removed the where it started with B and kind of smushed them together, if you can see that. So it reads, instead of just a one sentence purpose, it kind of flows into the overarching purpose that was kind of sort of there to begin with. Yeah, I don't exactly recall. This language is new language. We can be editing this if we find that we don't like that language. That came from the planning staff.
Okay.
So I guess here's the, for example, when we have site plan design standards, performance standards that are well intended, but offer, a canopy tree every 30 feet where there's just existing ledge and the person would have to blast in order to put a canopy tree in that may or may not survive. The board then can deliberate whether this standard is applicable in that sense and offer a waiver from a standard that may not be achieved. And the idea is for the board to be able to have that discussion, come to a conclusion about, if the waiver is granted, what else can be done on the site that tries to meet the intent. And that example is actually a real one from quite some time ago where, you were going to be asking a applicant to blast ledge to put in canopy trees or something. And
Right.
we figured out another solution with the waiver procedure.
So,
Right.
go ahead, Dan. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, I'm just, what you just said, Rod, that kind of clarifies the phrase context sensitive flexibility kind of.
It's because so the code, I guess I think of it, Dan, in a way that codes are written in a general format, right? That we don't know, the conditions of each site.
Right.
So, from my perspective, I trust the 7 adults that are on the planning board to deliberate and come to a conclusion about what the applicant is asking for.
Okay, I got it.
Given the site conditions, really.
Right.
And Rod, just following up on what Josh was saying, that next paragraph, did you make a note to insert the word deviation after minimum feasible? Because I think
I did not make that note. Would that clarify the minimum?
I think it would. I'm just reading it that way because it's saying minimum feasible what, So I think better probably put in the word deviation.
Gotcha.
Hey, Rod, I just joined.
Hey,
Hello,
Don.
all. I'll just listen in. You guys keep going.
So with that change, it would read the deviation is unavoidable and represents the minimum feasible deviation under the particular circumstances.
Yes.
That's what I'm hearing.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the three standards. The first one, which we were just discussing, unavoidable and represents the minimum feasible deviation. That seems like it might be a high bar. I don't know. Just thinking it through. The second one has the well-known phrase undue hardship, which I think is a fairly difficult standard to meet under the law. I haven't looked at the law on this issue in ages, but I remember looking at it a while ago. So the third one, the alternative proposal will allow for equal or better results than those stated in the applicable provisions. And that's where I think it's the example Rod gave with the ledge that needs to be blown up in order to plant trees. That seems to be the one that would be relied upon most often were we to decide to grant a waiver. Would you agree with that, Rod?
Yeah, I guess under, the applicant will identify what they're exactly asking for and hopefully guide you on how, the findings of fact for this. So, what exactly is a peculiar condition? That would be in the finding of fact. Minimum feasible deviation would also be in the finding of fact. The alternative proposal that's being proposed would also be a finding of, so those specifics as to the, whatever the site condition may be, whatever the applicant is identifying, that that's how you would kind of deduce which, and perhaps the applicant will do that prior to you folks even seeing it. But yeah, I don't know which one would, I think you're right. The undue hardship is a high bar.
And so without having the ordinance in front of me, I just don't know if there were other standards that we've used in the past to grant waivers that aren't reflected here. Do you know if there are other standards that we've used that aren't here that we've excluded in order to have one set of language?
I put them all in here, Josh. All of the
Okay.
standards that we did have. Yeah.
Okay. So when we've waived things in
I
the
will
past.
go back and look at that.
Okay. And just thinking, that example you gave about the ledge and the trees is an excellent one. And if we were looking at one, is that unavoidable? I don't think so, right? I mean, they could blast the ledge in order to plant the trees. So I just don't know what the words unavoidable and minimum feasible. But I also don't have an alternative for you at the moment. And if that's what we've used in the past, then we've lived with it and been able to work with it, so it should be fine. I'm just thinking about it.
The
Unfortunately,
deviation is sensible. That's a good one, isn't it?
sensible.
That might take an all-night review if we put that word in.
Right. Well, you know me, I like flexibility. At the same time, when we look back up at A in the purpose, context-sensitive flexibility, I get concerned about, we suggest in one context a waiver is appropriate, and in another context, the applicant argues is virtually the same. We say the waiver is not appropriate, and then we've got arbitrary and capriciousness or vagueness. So I'm on both sides of the issue, it seems. I want the flexibility, but I also don't want us to be subject to those arguments by applicants who are looking to figure out and divine what it is we're going to do with respect to a particular issue based on what we've done in the past. So those are more thoughts than helpful suggestions as to what we can do to the language. I think maybe it works. Just expressing my thoughts out loud at the moment.
Well, that made me have some thoughts to express also, that if these three provisions are separated by ors, so it can be 1, 2, or 3, but in reading through them, wouldn't it make more sense in some ways to have them separated by ands?
I think it's in between those two, Larry. I think number one applies all the time, right? I mean, ultimately, all of our waivers should represent the minimum feasible deviation from the standard, right?
Right.
I think the standard is either 2 or 3. So you as an applicant need to demonstrate that this proposal either is going to have some undue hardship, or that you've got a proposal that's going to perform as well as what the requirement is.
So
And
should it be and or, and then should the first one then be and then 2 and 3 are or?
I think number one just gets shifted to, some application either before or after this. I think it's probably after that. All right. Yeah. An applicant can request it for these 2 reasons. And then, with the granting of the planning board, of the waiver, the planning board is indicating that the deviation is unavoidable and represents the minimum. There's a summary there.
I would take the word unavoidable out. The deviation
I would.
represents the minimum feasible.
Yeah, that's what I was going to suggest too. Just say the deviation represents the minimum feasible deviation.
That's good.
Don't forget the second deviation.
Yeah, 2
Right.
deviations.
Well, that becomes the first deviation.
But
Well, that takes out. Yeah,
what I'm
I
hearing
mean,
there is number 1, remove unavoidable and put an and after it, and then 2 and 3 become the ors. I kind of like where that's going.
It's nice.
Yep.
I think that makes sense. If you
Yes.
if you take out the word unavoidable, you can argue both sides of what's unavoidable, right? So.
It's unavoidable that my client bought this property and is proposing this situation.
Oh, your client should have checked it out first.
Got a decent broker.
Yeah. So, hey, don't go down that path too far. All right. So are we, Scott, are you running this or who's running this?
Yeah, it's all you. I was just holding your place.
Oh, listen to you. Well, you can keep running the meeting. I'll just listen in.
Oh, no, you're here.
Okay.
Yes, it's your honor.
So do we have now I get to see you, right? Wow. All right. So do we have any other changes you guys need on that first item, or can we move on?
I'm okay.
Yeah, I think we can move on.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think I've got enough direction to have something for the next workshop.
It actually sounds like it's coming together nicely. So, all right. So you want to do use table categorization next?
Sure.
Andrew, you taking us through that?
Yeah, and what I'll do is I'll just kind of orient you to the things that I provided, and then I'm actually going to ask for your feedback just by email or by a phone call or something later on next week.
Okay.
These are, in short, I've provided 2 things. The first is our first crack at sorting all the uses into categories. So if you note here on this spreadsheet, there is the colored category, and that's represented by the top lines. This is the residential group with a household living and a group living category underneath of each one of those. These non-bolded uses under here are all of our existing uses. Rod, myself, and Tom Lister met and kind of sorted each one of these into its applicable category. Some of the uses are highlighted, like for instance, on our use table right now is a category that is hospital / nursing home / congregate care. When you look at the use in that kind of way, that really could get, put into group living for the congregate care portion, perhaps. nursing homes and hospitals, probably more of the medical variety. So those highlights aren't necessarily for you to look at or consider right now. That's really a reminder for me as we move through this process that I got to split that up on the table at some point in time in the future. So anyways, the first item is this first attempt at categorization. So each sheet is another series. So we went from, at the very beginning, was the residential group to now the civic group in the blue, to the commercial group, which is in another kind of purplish pinkish kind of color. The industrial group, which is an orangish color, and then a greenish open category. There's also an other, which is the catch-all miscellaneous. So everything that is either not categorical in the sense that it can be cataloged with other similar uses, but it's more of a, maybe it's a building type, or maybe it's just like the accessory use thing that applies everywhere. It's of all different types of category of use.
But while you're there, just a question, because I guess I relate it more to financials when I'm looking at, miscellaneous, and a lot of stuff starts getting thrown in there. Is there a way to make that a little bit smaller category, or is that kind of the stuff we have in there really doesn't belong anywhere else?
I mean, I would say we were pretty aggressive about trying to fit something into a category. These are 9 uses. For instance, like the home occupation major, we could shift those into the residential category, I suppose, because those only happen within residential dwelling units. But then they also are applicable in both a group setting as well as in a single, regular kind of residential setting. So I don't think so. I think that this is pretty tight, Don.
Okay.
Unfortunately. So that's the first document. If you can either provide your general feedback now, or if you have specific recommendations, hey, you'd prefer to see it titled this, or to combine this category with this category, or why did you put museum here? It should be this. You can do that now, or just shoot me an email with your preferences.
Does anybody have anything? Any comments?
Cool. The next attempt is within the memo itself. So each one of these subcategories, like household living, group living, community service, daycare, on the table, when we start categories and collecting these things together, there's kind of the catch-all. So it'll say civic, or it'll say medical facilities other than identified below. So this is the non-addiction treatment facility, non-medical clinic, and non-hospital use that we haven't identified. That's where it would be permissible. We have to create a definition for what medical facility means. So on this list within the memo itself, we have the staff proposed definition for each one of these subcategories. I created these by looking at other codes, frankly, going to some cheat sheets. Like we have a planner's advisory service. The American Planning Association has done this research where they have collected up kind of a glossary of use terms from all over the country. And there might be 4 or 5 different examples of what a medical facility is. So all I did was I went to the definitions and said, this one seems to be broad enough to collect up the uses that we already have defined. And it makes sense. It's succinct. It's clear enough to understand and to interpret. So in that case, for medical facility, the definition I'm proposing is a use concerned with the diagnosis, treatment, and care of human beings. Exceptionally broad, because it has to be broad in order for those other uses to fit inside of it too. So again, happy to receive your feedback now or on the specific definitions themselves. If you don't like the wording or this doesn't make sense or whatever, you can also send me an email. So either way.
Just one question. Is this the one we talked about, you think, given that or you're really doing a kind of a resort of the table that this we can do without it going to town meeting?
Not these additions of definitions. That absolutely requires town meeting. the reformatting to make it easier to use, like legibility and the reordering of the districts, that's something that we can do clerically. Any other deviation from what we already have approved is a town meeting trip.
All right, any comments?
Yeah, I have a couple, Don.
Go ahead.
On these catch-all land use definitions, say we have an applicant come in with something that doesn't fit, but it fits within the catch-all definition, whatever that is. Are we making the assumption that that would be a automatic permissible use or conditional use, or, you know?
We get to choose. So that comes down probably either at the next workshop or perhaps the workshop after that.
Because obviously
we're gonna have to decide, you know, where are medical facilities permitted as an overarching general category, as
Okay.
well as where are they conditional too. So that will be another one of those tasks. I'm kind of each workshop here is building off of the other.
Okay. Because I could just see, you know, depending on what the situation is, that, you know, it definitely could be not knowing what could be coming. Just hard to predict it. The other, on the definition of utilities, is that intended to include, obviously the public franchise is pretty obvious, but also private utilities like main natural gas, you know,
I
versus
think
a
so.
lot of different.
Yeah, it
Like-
wasn't intended that this was an and statement. It was an or. So I think, you know, a main natural gas is a closely regulated agency.
Okay.
Well, okay, I see what you're saying there.
Well, you said like under public franchise or ownership, it just, but regulated agency, I'm not, yeah, it's, may just want to review the language here, just make sure it captures any, you know, both, you know, regulated public and or privately owned utilities. I'm
Mhm.
assuming if they're a private utility, they're regulated by some
Right.
entity, but
Well, quasi-public as well, but anyway.
yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Any
I
other
would say
comment?
just one comment on the categorical overarching uses. So if something unforeseen comes to the town and gets placed in a category, that, you know, that placement will be via the code officer who interprets the code, which is appealable by any party. So I mean, there, you know, there's a catch-all appeals process that can happen based on interpretation as well.
But that's standard, that's his standard practice anyway.
Yeah, it is. But unfortunately, I think, you know, when we get into the categorical uses, it allows either the board, the code officer, to be a bit more proactive in assigning where this may be appropriate or not.
And I apologize for my highlighting and red text and everything else. The highlighting was a reminder for me to finish this one up, of which I did not do. So that reminder didn't even help me. And then the red is just a formatting error. But
Hey, Andrew,
yes,
there's some of these where there's existing definitions already in the code, right? Are some of them just changing the language of the definition, and some of them are brand new definitions, right?
correct. It's a mix. When I put this together into kind of the more official looking language kind of format, I'll be very clear about where we're changing the definition as opposed to adding a new definition. And sometimes it's that I have elevated an existing definition. For instance, a good representation of that is, let's see here. Well, okay. Retail sales and service. We have an existing definition for retail business, which is already pretty broad in its definition. I think that we can just elevate that to include be the overarching category as well as the specific use. So essentially, I'm proposing, hey, that language is already pretty good. That's what we will use to be the category language.
Okay, so you asked if anyone had any input over and above any comments tonight to send you email?
Yeah, that's fine. That'd be great.
Okay. Everybody ready to move on?
Yes.
All right, so the last item on last workshop, conditional use standards.
I was hopeful. Unfortunately, they changed some stuff on our network today, and I think that screwed up our home access. But I was hoping to just edit this conditional use standard document with you all today to come up with a final draft by the end of this, but I don't think we'll get there. Rod and I here have taken and as best as we were able to discern the conversation from the last meeting, made some edits to our existing standards. Notably, we have stricken the kind of long-range planning oriented standard, the one that was previously number 2. We've been a little bit more clear in what compatibility means when it relates to the neighborhood that the use is being proposed in. Let's see, other significant, Bruce really stressed that significant as an adjective to what adverse negative impact was in his mind was a very discerning component of what would be acceptable versus not. So we use that language in a couple of different places. The one that at least took me the most amount of brain power was the traffic related standard. We talked last time about trying to be as objective as possible, and I had kind of proposed going in the direction of having explicit standards related to level of service or some sort of metric that an applicant can produce and that we can review, of which I heard, no, that's probably too objective, or that, it's really difficult to discern, one engineer's approach versus another, and that at least in this field, it's a little bit harder to kind of say who's in the right. So I've tried to say here that we're concerned with two things: the capacity of the network, the fact that we want people to move efficiently and freely, as well as we want it to be a safe network, one that everyone is safe on. So the standard we have proposed is the anticipated traffic generated by the use will not cause a significant adverse negative impact on the safety or capacity of the transportation network for pedestrians, cyclists, and motorists. I think that this captures, again, the efficiency and capacity issue, the safety issue, who it applies to, and where it applies. We have added in a couple of nuisance-like descriptors here to the list of things that we don't want people to impact on adjacent property. And then we've left the last three pretty much alone. One notation that Rod and I had just after we pressed send on this on Friday was that we have nothing here related to the preservation or conservation of either natural resources or cultural resources. And when you look at other standards from other communities, in some of them, that is a reference concern. So anyways, this is the proposal that we were able to generate. Happy to receive your feedback now or later.
So Andrew, just a couple things real quick. One is in 4, where you've got odor and smell. Is that a distinction there, or do we need them both?
No. Which do you prefer?
It doesn't matter. Probably odor is
Yeah, we'll take out odor.
Is maybe, more politically whatever, but I really wanted to get what are we trying to say with number 2? And then how do we determine that?
The use will not hinder or discourage the appropriate development and use of adjacent land and buildings. I think this is a combination of the compatibility with the future development of the neighborhood standard that we already have, as well as there is, kind of this vein that I don't really necessarily think is great to follow too strongly, but in some standards in other communities, there's a detrimental value, economic value component where a use shouldn't degrade the value of property adjacent to it. I don't think we should be making decisions explicitly based on financial outcome. However, I think that this standard, at least is the way that I was thinking of it being written, was kind of saying, hey, this use shouldn't dramatically change someone's ability to use their land that's adjacent. I think it captures both of those concepts. But
Well, if it
I'm not
didn't-
wedded to that in any sort of way.
Yeah, no, my only thought is that where we talk about it, it's compatible with the scale, bulk, density, character of the area in which it is located, kind of captures what I think we're trying to say there. But I'm just trying to determine how I would rule on that to some extent, right? And then
I wonder
I
if-
would ask for Scott to comment on the deletion of what was number 2 about the comprehensive plan, right? Not to put you on the spot, Scott, but that's certainly, I'm not saying it shouldn't come out, but I would think you'd have some comments in regards to that. So,
I mean, I mentioned last time that I am not adverse to removing that, given the, it's really meaningless because you can interpret the comprehensive plan, so many different ways that it really doesn't provide any teeth. But along those lines, I think that we've included some of the conditions here that were in the examples from other areas. I think that number 2 was in something similar to that is in Sacco's. And I think, the addition of the pedestrians and cyclists and the traffic was in a couple of them too. I mean, my expectation was that we'd add a few more of these detailed conditions to this list from those examples, which we've started to. I think there's some others that we might want to think about too. That said, my hope is still that at some point we revisit what we're calling conditional in our use code down the line. I think we acknowledge that that is a bigger bite to take than we're ready to take right now. I think we also talked about it being something that we work in concert with CPEC on as they move along. So that's my take on removing the comp plan one.
yeah, thanks, Scott.
I have a couple comments, Don.
Go ahead.
Just kind of dovetailing on Scott's comments, number 2, the comp plan. I believe that was something similar, a reference to the comp plan and the conditional use was in a couple of the examples that you gave us last time. Maybe it was Augusta and Sacco, I can't remember. But I guess the word compatible versus consistency, consistency has some, legal terminology in regards to the comp plans. But the kind of the bigger question, I guess, maybe just to kick this back at you, Rod and Andrew, can long-range plans, the comp plan in particular, and I know under the Growth Management Act, it certainly has teeth with zoning amendments, but can those sorts of consistency evaluations by a board be used in a conditional use or a site plan setting if there's some gray area with the existing ordinance? I guess that's a question I'd like to maybe get some resolution before, final decision is made on that.
I'll chime in. I'm not a lawyer, so let me put that disclaimer out. But when a board makes any finding, that's the appealable, if you will, piece to the puzzle. So if the finding is consistent or inconsistent, you would specifically need to cite how you came to that conclusion.
Yep.
In looking at that, it is difficult because given the fact that conditional uses are essentially uses that are undecided upon by whoever's proposing them. What do we do? Permitted or not permitted? We don't know. Let's make it conditional. And typically because of the politics involved or what have you, it then comes down to a board to make the finding of whether or not it's consistent, it's compatible, it's all of these things. So essentially, you're kind of trying to look for standards that make pretty clear findings versus very vague findings. I think Andrew's really honing in on that. I mean, look at the standards that are being proposed and then realize some of the actual findings you can make because of the data that you've been given. So getting back to the comprehensive plan, a use comes in and says, I meet 10 bullets in the comprehensive plan, and the board members say you don't meet 12 bullets. That's an argument you guys would go through yourselves and come to a conclusion on. It's a difficult one to do because plans often, unless they're extremely clear, for instance, the Main Street plan actually did have building heights and setbacks and, very clear standards to meet. Density, which is often the one that becomes the issue for local planning. So again, it would, a measurable standard, and just consistent or inconsistent is a difficult one for a board to identify on either side. I mean, it's appealable either way at the end of the day.
Other comments?
And of course, some of that part of the consistent or compatible with the comprehensive plan, actually, I think probably comes in under the new number 2, where you talk about not hindering or discouraging the appropriate development and use of adjacent land and buildings. That's still comprehensive plan type idea to a certain extent, and can bring that into consideration. Yeah.
I mean, 1 and 2 can almost be smushed together in some sense. One, one, if it's not compatible with the scale and bulk and density, then it probably wouldn't meet the underlying zoning. And if that's the case, then the underlying zoning is incorrect or something.
Well,
But I
but
was
we
almost
did
looking
we
at
did
it
talk
as-
about like a proposed use that's immediately adjacent to another zoning district. That's where,
Right.
There's an
Right.
edge or transition between zoning districts. That's where your form might change, and there could be significant tension between the two zoning
Yeah.
districts, two uses, or the neighborhood and the commercial area. Whatever it is about the physical size.
True.
Right, yeah.
And those conflicts are actually quite common between residential and commercial districts in the downtown, especially.
Yeah.
I
I like
thinking
1
that
and
I
2
think
separate.
I got there too. I was looking at it as smushing them, but keeping them separate gives you more findings to review.
Hey,
Exactly.
Rod, and I see the phrase adverse negative impacts, it's in our conditional uses. I've seen it referenced in the other examples. Does the addition of the word significant cause any, kind of gets, what's significant versus adverse impact? Does it create, more shades of gray, or does it help the situation, I guess? I guess I'm kind of looking at it, like the comp plan argument. I mean,
I don't see I don't see significant value by adding significant to the language.
right.
I only added it in only for the sake that was an explicit. Bruce's suggestion last meeting was if you add that to that statement, that makes it much clearer in my mind. So for the sake of just trying to clarify it and move the conversation down the road.
Because I guess you would argue, okay, is a little bit of adverse impact good or okay, but so I guess in my mind the word significant adds more subjectivity to the phrase, I guess. I don't know.
So my take on that is that, like Bruce, I agree that significant would certainly help me, because any development any proposed development, any proposed use is typically going to have some sort of adverse impact. And so saying it has to be a significant adverse impact, I think that's an easier standard for me to understand.
Yes, it's what keeps lawyers employed.
Well, we like that.
We don't get paid.
We like that. And yes, I agree with Josh that it because it's the whole thing is that, you know, bigger than a bread box, smaller than a house type standard. So it is something that I think we really should have the word significant in there.
On the clause 2 that Don referred to and was questioning, and that we've been discussing, I too would have the same questions. And I think that my issues arise around the use of the word appropriate. I don't know that we're,
Mhm.
you know,
That is value laden judgment right there. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd almost want, maybe you could work up a couple examples of where we would say no and where we would say yes.
I mean, Andrew, you referred to other ordinances that actually reference an economic impact in the conditional use provision of their ordinance, and that happened to be what we did in my old planning board. We had that issue came up when someone was proposing a daycare center next to or in a neighborhood, and it wasn't permitted. And so the question was, would putting a daycare center next door to this property have a negative adverse or a negative impact on the economic value of neighboring properties? And for me, that was relatively easy to sort of sort through and see that it probably would. So I wouldn't be opposed to that sort of language either. Not suggesting we go to it, just saying that that's not something that, if 2 is intended to get to that concept, stating
Understood.
it wouldn't be an issue.
You're not scared of saying it. Yeah, I get it. Okay.
Well, and what happens when you remove appropriate out of there? Is that?
Yeah, we kind of lose the right?
If you remove appropriate, then I get a little more comfortable with it. But I think you do lose the to Andrew's point. I wouldn't be comfortable with appropriate in there.
Right. I see no, I mean, yeah, I'd say let's strike appropriate. I don't, you know, I think you lose some of the long range value that the former number 2 used to provide. But also this gets to acute impact. So kind of the stuff like odor, vibration, light, smell, right? You know, hindering the development of that property, as well as, hey, I had this property that was worth X, and now it doesn't have that same value. I think that still works.
Is there a way to perhaps sneak in the planning stuff with weak language, perhaps something like the proposal shall, or the use identifies and
What's the point? I mean, you know,
well, just that we're not veering away from plans. I mean, you know, so the use identifies and conforms with long range planning goals of the community, or some.
Can you, instead of the word appropriate, can you go back to the compatibility word? Compatible development? I mean, I don't know, maybe that, or consistent or compatible. And that, because appropriate, I think consistent and compatibility are kind of words that are kind of ingrained in the code, and there's some legal, you know, basis up to those terms, versus appropriate is, again, more of a subjective term.
Well, my thought on that is that, I mean, this is a ridiculous case, but let's say that you're talking about a pig farm in a residential area that does have some vacant land that somebody wants to put some houses on. So you grant the pig farm conditional use. Well, you're looking at granting the pig farm conditional use, and that use will hinder or discourage the development of adjacent land and buildings.
You're never
you
going
say-
to ever permit a pig farm. Right?
You've
Right,
uh,
But
yeah,
effectively,
you have the lightning
politically
rod of the right to farm stuff, Larry.
Right. Oh, I know that, but if you say consistent development, then you say, okay, well, you have some vacant land, you could have a pig farm too, you know. So I don't have a problem taking out appropriate. I just think there's not a good adjective to go back in there.
Yeah, I agree with that. It is a hard one to.
mhm.
I would,
Would it be, I mean, I know we were trying to get away from, the comp plan in terms of, all the different components of the comp plan, but could you focus it more on just the future? I don't know, you get your current zoning, but whatever the future land use objectives are that may be outlined in those comp plans, in general terms. And somehow link it to that, kind of limiting the broad
scope.
brush scope of the comp plan connotation and really focusing on the growth or the future land use planning provisions of those plans and how it could apply in a conditional use. I don't know, just a thought.
I mean, that's the hurdle we were trying to get over. Actually, this whole time with, I mean, I understand that it is hard to. I guess if like the language I was thinking of, even soft language considers future land use goals or whatever.
Yeah.
That, if you guys make a negative finding on that, that's somewhat ambiguous.
Yeah, very.
It's a hard metric, in other words, to really put there.
So Josh, were you trying to weigh in?
I was trying to weigh in on 2 and just explain that when I read language in 2 and I keep in mind this reference to economic impact that I know that is not here, but I think other ordinances have it when they're discussing conditional use, and the point of that is to protect the neighboring properties. Because I think I'm hearing some folks say we want language here to allow us to ensure that the project is consistent with the towns or the community's expectation around future development. And yet I'm reading it to say, I want to make sure that the people who own neighboring properties or abutting properties aren't going to be negatively impacted in an economic sense by the project. And I think that if you don't have appropriate, we're not getting into judgments about whether the development is consistent with our plans for the future of the area. But at the same time, we can read that language to mean that the development of the project or the use won't hinder or discourage the development by having an adverse impact on the economic value of adjacent land and buildings. So in short, I think we're trying to address 2 things with one sentence. One group of folks here are trying to address a concern around future development, and I'm personally trying to address a concern about neighboring properties and their economic value. And that's hard to do in a sentence.
I agree with you, Josh. I think it should be 2 separate bullets again. And I think one of them that is really good is the one that addresses, I think it addresses what you're wanting to get in there, is number 7 from Sacco. I'll just read it real quick. It's the proposed use will not have a significant detrimental effect on the value of adjacent properties that could be avoided by reasonable modification of the plan. I think it's or something like that would get at what you're talking about. And then maybe we could reword something to get at this long range stuff. With whether it's consistent with or some other wording to try and get at that. that was one of the ones from soccer that I had circled as thinking it might be a good one to try and include here in some way.
Yeah, I agree with that, Scott. I think that's a good one.
That reasonable modification modifier there at the end, I think that's an important component of that, Scott. And I think that's good.
That's what I underlined.
Yeah.
I wasn't as focused on the, I mean, I think it's good to not, impact the value of the butters, but I do think it's nice to have that extra avoided by reasonable modification of the plan. I think that should be an expectation for anything that comes before us with conditional use. If you just tweak this a little bit, do you actually not need this to be conditional? So anyway, as far as the impact, I like that one.
Yep.
So I don't have a lot of suggestions right now on how to tweak the language to get the other point across that we're struggling with, to try and have it consistent with future, what the expectations are for that area.
Well, and from to Andrew's point, the last time we met, and the reason that came out was because it seemed as though the board was alerting us to the fact that that should be removed. So perhaps we just put that to bed at some point and clarify whether or not we discuss future plans or not.
So Rod, is there language in some of the other plans that address that? Because you're right, what's really happening in the discussion, and I agree with Scott, I like the Sacco one that he read. We're still, the other piece of it is whether we call it comprehensive plan or not, future plans is basically kind of the same thing, right? To some extent. And so the real question is there language in some of the others that addresses future plans, right? Whether it's called comprehensive plan or not.
Yes, and it is substantially similar to the language we already have.
Okay, so I guess the real question is, do we want that in there or not? Right, whether
Right.
it's called comprehensive plan, future plans, or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
so
it causes, in certain cases, it causes some strong debates, I suppose. And in other cases, it doesn't. I mean, that's not one that I've seen. In the cell tower one, Don, was not predicated on that standard.
No, you're right.
The parking lot that the recreation department put in was found to be compatible. I mean, some of the conditional uses that we've had issues with in the past, it's not typically come down to that, other than the Aroma Joe one. That was the most recent.
Yeah, what was the event center? Remember the one out River Road where she wanted to turn the big barn into a wedding venue?
Well, actually, so that one, that was
I'm
actually.
trying to remember the rulings or findings on that one.
Yeah, it wasn't. You guys were okay with the conditional standards were okay. It was the rural entrepreneurial use that it didn't meet, that everything was happening within the building, if I remember correctly. That the tent and everything was outside of the building.
Yeah, okay.
So Bruce isn't here to sort of reiterate his concern around the language that references compatibility with the comprehensive plan. I do remember agreeing with his point, and I think the point was it's hard to. Number one, I have questions whether or not a town that has a comprehensive plan and an ordinance, if the terms of the comprehensive plan aren't built into the ordinance, then are those terms binding on applicants when they merely sit in the comprehensive plan? I don't know the answer to that question. I felt like it had been dealt with by courts in the past, and they had concluded that no, the ordinance is what is binding. And if there's a comprehensive plan, the terms of that plan have to be reflected in the ordinance. So if that's the case, then I wouldn't want to reference a comprehensive plan. And so then we're talking about references to future development. anticipated future development, and how does the board determine what the anticipated future development of a neighborhood is? And I don't know. I mean, the comprehensive plan is aspirational. It says this is what we'd like to have, but how do we as board members say to an applicant, well, it's a very nice project, it really fits in here, it's not going to have any adverse impact on traffic, physical characteristics are wonderful, but you know what, we weren't really looking for that type of development in this neighborhood. I mean, based on what exactly?
And
So that kind of
therein
gets
lies,
yeah.
like I say, therein lies the rub, and that was what Bruce was pointing out.
Exactly.
Here's
Well,
here's
and
a
the other piece to that, sorry, so the comprehensive plan and the legality and the teeth that are embedded with the Growth Management Act, a developer in Scarborough, 20 years ago now, the town did not update their zoning code to reflect the comprehensive plan, where it was Dunstan Corner, I believe, where they wanted a high density neighborhood. They never made the code for it. A developer came in who bought the land in anticipation of that zoning change, then brought the town to court because they weren't implementing their comprehensive plan. So it works on both sides of the equation for the landowner who was anticipating the future plan to be implemented. So
So Rod, would MMA have any thoughts on this that could help?
yeah, we can pass it off to the free attorney use at MMA for sure.
I'm just wondering if
I
they,
mean, any thoughts with the plan? I mean, I don't know about this particular standard. We can inquire though.
I mean, I think
Well-
too, one of the things that we have to remember is that the comprehensive plans come in all different kinds of flavors. And, we keep on dealing with the more subjective, nebulous, visionary, kind of narrative type of plan, but they're also very objective plans, and they're very objective implementation strategies too. And the more objective that the plan is, the easier it is to make a finding. And I think, although we're talking about compatibility with the comprehensive plan, I wonder about, you have the perfect project. Everything they meet the code, everything's there. It requires conditional use approval. They're proposing it in a place that we are calling out for a road. Like, it's a very objective measure in the comp plan. There's, we're suggesting that there should be a road from point A to point B. The only thing wrong with this entire project is that building is going right in the middle of that road. We would want to, I would assume that the town would want to preserve the opportunity for us to develop that road in the future. Sometimes conditional use standards, or sometimes even site plan standards, can require or say, hey, you can't build it if a comprehensive plan calls out for a specific infrastructure to be placed someplace. I will say, if we strike references to long range planning, that issue of very specific recommendations, and my direct
Right.
application is like infrastructure. Like, we need X in order to deal with this demand issue. We need this road here. We need a signal here. We need a pipe here, whatever. If a project is getting in the way of doing that, I see that as being something that would not be in the interest of the community. That's the only thing that, and I'm not saying I know what the answer is. That's just another place where an objective measure in the comp plan could have a significant impact on a project that we're reviewing kind of through the conditional use lens.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, there's definitely portions, particularly the 2019 updates, a perfect example. There's a lot of very specific objective type content, but there's some other stuff, like you said. But if there's a way, but I keep going back to looking at all of our plans. Some of the long range planning specific to the land use policy is pretty objective in all those plans. So, maybe that part of the long range comp plan could be kind of a focus area of a conditional use. I'm just, I'll give it a little bit more thought between now and the next meeting. like you said, infrastructure. I mean, we've been talking about extending water and sewer across, to the western side of 295 for years, or having a bypass road that goes to the business park area. Those are the sorts of things you'd want to strategically, if it helps the long-term vision of the town in a bigger picture, you'd want to preserve somehow.
Well, I mean, even last year at this time, when we were considering Andy Maynard's expansion plans for a mobile home park, right? We talked about that the concept of a road, that cutover road coming from 196 up to 201 across that property. And one of the concerns of the board was we shouldn't let them expand everything because we want to reserve this land for both business park and the road purposes. So, certainly we see value in implementing those kinds of strategies. I would say, Don, if folks, if you have specific recommendations or additional thoughts, just email me. I'll take a look at the recording of this meeting and try and pull out some discernible little nugget to change.
Well, one thing to think about for board members, in the absence of not identifying that standard, are we then disregarding the plans? I mean, it's just food for thought if we don't address it at all.
Right.
And that's kind of why I was talking, and I'm not saying MMA has all the answers, but maybe they've dealt with it, right? And certainly if you explain to them what we're looking at, is there better language to capture what the intent of what you're trying to make sure we're protecting?
How about the not hinder or discourage the future?
The appropriate for future development.
Yeah.
As long as the plans are appropriate, yeah.
As long as the plans, yeah. All right. Okay, so any other comments? Otherwise, are we ready to wrap?
Yes.
Okay, that sounds good. All right, guys, do we have a project for the meeting on the 2nd?
Not looking that way.
Okay.
It'll probably just be the Rod and Andy show again.
All right. Well,
Yes,
do we
Don,
need-
there are projects. They're just not ready for your review quite yet.
Right. All right. So I guess can we sort of? I mean, I guess I'll leave it up to the board. But do we? I'm not sure. I think we need 3 workshops in a row, right? Can we maybe either cancel next week's or next meeting if it's going to be just workshops, or would the board rather a workshop?
Personally, I'd prefer to have a workshop that follows applications. So do it all in one meeting.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was leaning, right? So
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
we're not up against a time crunch on this at this point, right? If we put it off,
We'll be getting there.
we're getting there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
I mean, I'm feeling comfortable with the waiver stuff, but this we're getting into, we may need to,
mhm.
The back and forth can be via email too. So what I would suggest is that you guys feel free to be putting the red pencils to this, sending your thoughts, and what we can do is compile all of what we've heard from the board for the next time we meet
Okay. All right.
and publicly discuss it.
Yeah, 'cause
I need to keep going back and forth a little bit in order to advance stuff. I understand the value in not having a meeting, but
And I think trying to keep some momentum or continuity going, with these, so time doesn't pass and we take a step backwards. So I think that's good if we can kind of collaborate on it if we don't have an official workshop.
Okay. All right. So then, unless I hear strong objections, we will not have a planning board on the 2nd. But we will, please do get comments and so forth into these guys. And so they can keep the ball rolling. Okay.
And share them out to us.
Yes, please.
Yes.
All right. Anything else, folks? All right.
I think we're all set, Don.
All right. Good night. Thank